Modern blockbusters have a peculiar way of feeling weightless. We sit in air-conditioned theaters, watching $200 million digital avatars bounce off pixelated debris, untethered from gravity, mass, or genuine threat. The modern visual effects engine operates with clean, sterile efficiency, smoothing over every rough edge until the extraordinary becomes completely unremarkable. But cast your mind back to 2005. Turn back the clock to an era just before green screen volume walls and seamless digital safety nets swallowed Hollywood whole. When Peter Jackson walked out of the fires of Middle-earth, bearing $3 billion in box office revenue and an unprecedented collection of 17 Academy Awards, he was handed the ultimate Hollywood rarity, a completely blank check. He didn't use it to launch a safe, assembly line franchise. Instead, Jackson poured every ounce of his post-Lord of the Rings clout into resurrecting a primal nightmare from his childhood, building a brutal, terrifying, and deeply tragic epic that remains the last true auteur-driven mega-blockbuster. Look closely at the creatures that inhabit Jackson's Skull Island. They are not clean. They are not polished to a high-gloss studio sheen. The digital craftsmen at Weta didn't just model dinosaurs and giant insects, they textured them with scars, caked them in real-looking mud, and animated them with a violent, animalistic urgency that feels frighteningly tactile. When the giant ape finally emerges from the mist, he isn't a friendly cinematic icon meant for toy sales. He is an old, battered king, his fur matted with dried blood, his face bearing the jagged history of 1,000 life-or-death battles against a hostile ecosystem. The violence is heavy, the mud has weight, and the terror feels uncomfortably real. When this creature inevitably falls from the heights of the Empire State Building, crashing onto the frozen asphalt of New York City, it isn't just the end of a monster. It is the agonizing culmination of human greed and cinematic hubris. Jackson took a pulp creature feature and transformed it into a breathtaking opera about conquest, spectacle, and the tragic impulse to commodify what we cannot understand. Yet, history has treated this film with a bizarre form of historical amnesia. Upon its release, it was a staggering critical success, capturing 3 Academy Awards and grossing over $550 million worldwide. Critics praised its scale, and audiences were floored by its sheer audacity. Yet today, in an era obsessed with dissecting every frame of cinema through video essays and online retrospectives, Jackson's masterpiece is frequently dismissed as an overstuffed, 3-hour exercise in directorial ego. It has quietly drifted into the margins of cinematic memory. How did a film that pushed visual storytelling to its absolute limits, combining raw creature feature horror with sweeping classical tragedy, become so profoundly misunderstood? To understand why this epic vanished from our collective conversation, we have to look past the surface of the roar, venture deep into the fog of Skull Island, and uncover the terrifying beauty hidden inside Peter Jackson's grandest obsession. To truly understand why this film occupies such a strange, paradoxical place in cinematic history, we must look beyond the simple narrative of a giant ape on a rampage. What Peter Jackson crafted in 2005 is not merely a remake of a 1933 creature feature. It is a sprawling, deeply self-reflective examination of the filmmaking process itself. Over the course of this exploration, we will dismantle the film piece by piece, tracing its evolution from an 11-year-old boy's obsessive dream in New Zealand to a 3-hour masterclass in visual storytelling. We will examine the sheer physical and artistic labor required to bring Skull Island to life, unpacking how groundbreaking technology was weaponized not to sanitize a monster, but to give him a soul. Our journey will navigate the structural architecture of the film across 4 distinct acts. We will examine the claustrophobic Depression-era streets of New York, where economic desperation drives desperate decisions. We will sail into the suffocating fog of the uncharted Pacific, where the voyage of the SS Venture becomes a psychological descent into madness. We will confront the untamed, prehistoric nightmare of Skull Island, analyzing how Jackson uses horror mechanics and environmental storytelling to create an ecosystem that actively rejects human intrusion. Finally, we will return to the gleaming, tragic concrete jungle of Manhattan, where spectacle is chained, put on display, and ultimately destroyed by its own admirers. At the center of our analysis is a crucial analytical lens, Carl Denham. Denham is not just a manic impresario within the plot, he is the ultimate avatar for Hollywood's predatory gaze. He represents the unquenchable thirst of the entertainment industry, a force that commodifies beauty, exploits violence, and destroys untamed art in the pursuit of box office success. In Denham, Jackson holds up a mirror to the movie industry, asking uncomfortable questions about the cost of visual obsession and the ethics of capturing wonder on camera. For film enthusiasts who have grown weary of surface-level plot recaps and algorithmically driven content, this re-examination offers something far more substantial. In an era dominated by hollow reboots, weightless digital backdrops, and corporate studio mandates, Jackson's King Kong stands as a monument to uncompromising artistic vision. By dissecting its thematic depth, visual design, and emotional core, we will uncover why this 20-year-old epic is not a bloated relic of the past, but a vital piece of cinematic craftsmanship that demands to be understood. Cast your mind back to December of 2005. For an entire generation of moviegoers, walking into a theater that winter was an experience etched permanently into memory. You didn't just watch Peter Jackson's King Kong, you survived it. It was a time when cinema held a distinct physical weight. You remember sitting in the dark, clutching a massive tub of popcorn, mesmerized as the screen exploded with a level of creature action that felt almost overwhelming. You remember the raw, chest-rattling audio design as 3 ferocious Virexes snapped their jaws inches from Endero, followed by the breathless choreography of a knuckle-widening brawl across collapsing vine-covered cliffs. And then, of course, there was the collective trauma. Ask anyone who saw this film in their youth about the bug pit, and watch their eyes widen. That horrific, suffocating sequence down in the dark ravine, where swarming, fleshy invertebrates and giant carnivores slowly engulfed the crew, instantly scarred millions of viewers, cementing the island as a place of pure, unadulterated nightmare fuel. That intensity spilled far beyond the silver screen, fueling the iconic tie-in video game that placed us directly into Jack Driscoll's mud-soaked boots, desperately counting every single rifle round as the jungle closed in. This was the golden age of cinematic events, anchored by the height of physical media and DVD culture. We didn't just watch movies, we collected them. We spent hours diving into multi-disc special feature sets, studying production diaries, and obsessing over how weighted digital brought miniature sets and digital mud to life. Jackson's epic belonged to a vibrant era where blockbusters were treated as monolithic artistic endeavors rather than disposable streaming content meant to be scrolled past on a phone screen. Yet, as familiar as these memories might feel, most viewers only scratched the surface of what was actually happening on screen. Behind the terrifying creature designs and grand action set pieces lies a dense web of hidden visual storytelling, mythological allegories, and manic behind-the-scenes decisions that completely transform the narrative upon closer inspection. From subtle camera movements that parallel Denham's lens with the monster's eye, to hidden thematic details woven into the island's haunting architecture, there is a vast, undiscovered film waiting right beneath the surface. What you experienced in 2005 was merely the entry point. What lies hidden inside Jackson's grand vision will permanently change the way you look at this cinematic monument forever. Every great cinematic monument is built upon the foundation of a singular, consuming obsession. For Peter Jackson, that obsession began on a quiet evening in Pukerua Bay, New Zealand, when a 9-year-old boy tuned into a television broadcast of Marion C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack's 1933 masterpiece, King Kong. The image of a stop-motion ape roaring atop the Empire State Building did not merely entertain young Jackson, it shattered his understanding of reality. It revealed to him the magical, manipulative power of cinema. Driven by an immediate desire to recreate that enchantment, the young filmmaker attempted to build his own Kong model using wire, rubber, and fur from his mother's old coat, capturing it frame by tedious frame with a Super 8mm camera. That crude, homemade puppet was not a passing childhood hobby. It was the seed of a lifelong creative destination. Decades later, after carving his name into cult cinema with visceral, low-budget horror, Jackson found himself on the precipice of realizing that childhood dream. In 1996, Universal Pictures approached him to helm a remake. Jackson and his partner Fran Walsh threw themselves into the project, crafting a script filled with light-hearted, Indiana Jones-style pulp adventure, complete with witty banter and fantastical set pieces. Visual assets were built, pre-visualization animatics were constructed, and prep work was well underway. Then, the Hollywood studio machine intervened. Facing competing monster projects like TriStar's Godzilla and Universal's own remake of The Mummy, executives panicked over monster fatigue. The rug was pulled out overnight, and Jackson's dream was shelved. Yet, fate works in mysterious ways. Forced to pivot, Jackson poured his imaginative energy into a project many in Hollywood considered impossible, adapting J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. What followed was one of the most miraculous chapters in cinema history. The trilogy did not just succeed, it reshaped global pop culture, earning nearly $3 billion and concluding with the return of the King's sweeping 11 Academy Awards. Jackson was no longer just a talented director, he was a cinematic deity, wielded unrivaled creative authority. Universal realized their monumental mistake. Eager to bring Jackson back into the fold, they offered him a deal that sent shockwaves through the industry, a $20 million upfront directorial fee against 20% of the gross box office revenue, the highest sum ever paid to a director at that time. Jackson had his ultimate blank check. However, the director who returned to King Kong in 2003 was vastly different from the man who had drafted the 1996 script. Having spent years grounded in the authentic, tragic weight of Tolkien's mythology, Jackson, Walsh, and co-writer Philippa Boyens completely discarded their old, pulpy script. They realized that to make a monster story resonate in the 21st century, it could not be a light-hearted cartoon. It had to be anchored in stark, unapologetic realism. The trio immersed themselves in the history of the Great Depression, constructing a script that treated 1930s New York not as a romanticized backdrop, but as a desperate, grinding landscape of poverty, breadlines, and artistic desperation. By grounding the narrative in the harsh realities of human survival, the arrival of the impossible would feel all the more jarring. They reframed the narrative core. This was no longer a simple story about a giant gorilla eating crew members, but a multi-layered tragedy about human ambition, imperialist exploitation, and two lonely souls finding an improbable connection amidst chaos. Translating this massive vision into reality required a physical and logistical undertaking of terrifying proportions. Operating out of Stone Street Studios in Wellington, New Zealand, Jackson mounted a production budgeted at $207 million, a staggering figure that made it one of the most expensive films ever produced at the time. The logistics were staggering. To recreate Depression-era Manhattan, art directors built a vast, full-scale backlit set featuring blocks of Broadway, complete with vintage streetcars, elevated train tracks, period vehicles, and period-accurate signage. Every store window was dressed with authentic 1930s props. Simultaneously, the production had to construct the nightmare realm of Skull Island. Instead of relying purely on digital environments, Jackson insisted on building massive, tactile sets filled with tons of real mud, hand-carved stone ruins, and intricate miniature landscapes known as bigatures. The scale of the physical production was so vast that it stretched New Zealand's infrastructure to its absolute limit, employing thousands of local artisans, sculptors, set builders, and technicians. Jackson was not merely making a movie. He was constructing a self-contained industrial apparatus designed to pull an impossible world out of thin air. By the winter of 2005, the global film industry found itself standing at a strange, uncertain crossroads. The cultural monoliths that had defined pop culture for half a decade were suddenly reaching their definitive conclusions. New Line Cinema had just closed the book on The Lord of the Rings with the historic Oscar sweep of The Return of the King, while Lucasfilm had brought the prequel era to a dark, operatic end with Star Wars, Episode III, Revenge of the Sith. Hollywood was ravenous for its next cinematic savior, a new mega-event capable of filling theaters and capturing the collective imagination of a rapidly evolving global audience. Universal Pictures, having invested an astronomical sum into Peter Jackson's return to big-budget filmmaking, wasn't just releasing a movie. They were banking on a cultural phenomenon that needed to justify the massive studio apparatus built entirely around one man's vision. The stakes for Universal were terrifyingly high. Jackson was no longer treated as a director for hire. He was marketed as a brand unto himself, a maestro whose name alone was meant to guarantee masterwork status. To build anticipation, Jackson did something that fundamentally altered how films would be marketed in the digital age. Long before social media clips and synchronized studio TikTok campaigns became standard procedure, Jackson bypassed traditional press junkets and launched a groundbreaking series of online production diaries. Starting deep in pre-production and continuing through principal photography and post-production, Jackson released short, intimate, highly detailed video blogs directly to the internet. These webisodes stripped away the artificial gloss of typical Hollywood EPK featurettes. Viewers were granted an unprecedented, raw look into the sheer mechanics of blockbuster filmmaking, watching miniature builders hand-carve scale models of Skull Island's jagged cliffs, sound designers recording real animal roars in rainforests, and visual effects artists at weighted digital pulling all-nighters to render millions of digital hair strands. It created a profound sense of community and intimacy between the filmmakers and millions of fans worldwide, turning the stressful, chaotic reality of movie production into a compelling daily narrative. At the epicenter of this pre-release frenzy was weighted digital. Fresh off consecutive Academy Award wins for bringing Gollum and the vast armies of Middle-earth to life, the New Zealand visual effects house was widely regarded as the gold standard of digital artistry. The industry looked toward Weta with equal parts awe and skepticism. Bringing a giant gorilla to life was not simply about rendering a massive creature. it required creating an emotional protagonist that could hold the screen opposite a live-action actress without uttering a single line of human dialogue. The pressure on Weta to deliver a digital performance that possessed genuine soul, subtlety, and physical weight was unlike anything the visual effects industry had ever attempted. Yet, behind the breathless excitement, a cloud of intense industry anxiety began to form as the release date drew near. What had started as an ambitious $150 million project began to balloon rapidly under the sheer weight of Jackson's perfectionism. As post-production dragged on, the budget escalated to an eye-watering $207 million, forcing Jackson to personally cover the $32 million overage out of his own pocket to preserve his complete creative control. Even more alarming to studio executives was the film's final runtime. Jackson delivered an epic that stretched to an astounding 187 minutes, over 3 full hours for a story traditionally told in 90 minutes. In the cold, calculating eyes of studio distribution departments, a 3-hour runtime was a commercial hazard. It meant fewer daily theater screenings per screen, slower turnarounds, and a heavy test of the average moviegoer's endurance during the competitive holiday season. Trade headlines began to speculate wildly, asking whether Jackson's unbridled creative freedom had turned into a case of unchecked directorial megalomania. Could a creature feature truly sustain 3 hours of dramatic tension? Was the public ready to embrace a tragic, slow-burn period piece masked as a creature feature? As December 14, 2005 approached, the film landscape held its breath, waiting to see if Peter Jackson's ultimate passion project would emerge as another historic triumph or a legendary studio gamble gone wrong. Peter Jackson opens his 3-hour epic not with a roar, but with a mournful, jazz-inflected montage that immediately anchors the film in the bleak, uncompromising reality of 1933 New York City. The Great Depression is in full, crushing force. Through a sequence of stark visual contrasts, Jackson juxtaposes images of captive zoo animals behind iron bars with men sleeping under newspapers in Central Park, breadlines stretching around snow-covered city blocks, and the flickering, desperate escapism of vaudeville theater. It is a world where everything, art, dignity, and human life itself, has been reduced to a basic transaction for survival. By taking 40 minutes to establish this economic wasteland before a single fantastic element is introduced, Jackson lays a vital thematic foundation. The real monsters are not hiding in unexplored jungles, but are bred right here in the cold, transactional heart of human civilization. It is within this landscape of systemic collapse that we meet Darrow, brought to life with fragile grace by Naomi Watts. Anne is a vaudeville performer whose theater shuttered overnight, leaving her bankrupt and starving on the freezing streets of Manhattan. Jackson treats her desperation with profound empathy. We watch as she gazes longing into the warm window of a diner, her stomach aching, before contemplating taking a stolen apple from a fruit stand, only to be stopped by her own internal moral code. And represents pure artistic integrity pushed to the absolute brink of physical extinction. She is not seeking fame or luxury, she simply wishes to perform, to bring joy, and to survive without surrendering her dignity. Enter Carl Denham, played with manic, predatory magnetism by Jack Black. Denham is the dark counterweight to Anne's vulnerability. A silver-tongued rogue filmmaker running one step ahead of police subpoenas and furious studio executives who want to seize his footage, Denham is a man entirely consumed by artistic hubris and financial desperation. He doesn't view cinema as art, he views it as a game of high-stakes conquest, a weapon to manipulate emotion and extract capital. When his lead actress abandons his secret production on the eve of departure, Denham wanders the streets looking for a replacement, happening upon and just as she collapses from hunger after attempting to return the stolen apple. Recognizing her beauty and vulnerability, Denham pounces like a predator who has spotted injured prey. He buys her a hot meal and spins a hypnotic web of promises, exploiting her artistic admiration for renowned playwright Jack Driscoll to coerce her into joining his mysterious expedition. It's not about money, Denham lies smoothly. It's about discovering something real. He sells her a fantasy of artistic fulfillment, concealing the fact that he is dragging her onto a rusty tramp steamer bound for uncharted waters without a permit, a script, or a safety net. The recruitment of Jack Driscoll, played with quiet intellectual weariness by Adrian Brody, completes this central trio of artistic archetypes. Driscoll is an acclaimed Broadway playwright who represents highbrow, legitimate theater, the very institution Denham openly despises yet desperately needs to validate his sensationalist spectacle. In a brilliant sequence of comedic manipulation, Denham tricks Driscoll into staying aboard the departing vessel, the SS Venture, by delaying his payment check until the ship physically unties from the dock. As the vessel slips into the foggy waters of New York Harbor, Driscoll realizes he is trapped, forced to write a screenplay on the fly for a movie whose true subject matter he cannot possibly fathom. The journey aboard the SS Venture marks a crucial transition point in the film's architecture. As Manhattan's iconic skyline fades into a wall of oppressive gray fog, Jackson establishes a palpable sense of isolation and creeping dread. The ship itself is a grimy, rust-bucket vessel operated by hardened mercenaries, smearing oil and smoke across the pristine ocean horizon. Here, isolated from the laws of civilization, the core thematic motifs of the film begin to crystallize: the exploitative nature of the artistic gaze, the commodification of beauty, and the insatiable human desire to conquer the unknown. Denham paces the deck with his camera like a weapon, entirely unconcerned with the risks he is imposing on his cast and crew. He is driven by a singular, dangerous obsession, a conviction that out there, beyond the uncharted mist, lies a spectacle so vast it will immortalize his name, no matter how many lives must be sacrificed to capture it on celluloid. The SS Venture churns deeper into the vast expanse of the Southern Pacific. The historical realism of Depression-era Manhattan quietly gives way to an atmosphere of claustrophobic, supernatural dread. The bright ocean light dims, replaced by a permanent, unnatural gloom that settles heavy over the ship. Jackson uses this prolonged voyage to mirror the psychological shift of his characters. Civilized norms begin to erode as the physical map runs out. The compass spins wildly, radio contact dissolves into static, and the crew finds itself adrift in waters untouched by modern navigation. Captain Engelhorn and his men, hardened sailors who have seen the darkest corners of the globe, speak in hushed tones about forgotten legends and uncharted landmasses. The vessel is no longer just a ship, it is a tiny, fragile bubble of human arrogance drifting across an ancient, indifferent ocean. Amidst this creeping tension, Jackson carefully cultivates the romantic heart of the film through the growing connection between Darrow and Jack Driscoll. Their relationship develops not through glossy Hollywood melodrama, but through quiet, authentic moments of shared artistic soulfulness. Away from the cold realities of New York and the manic demands of Denham, Anne and Jack find solace in one another. Jack, accustomed to writing detached stage plays, finds in Anne an inspiring muse, someone who understands the emotional truth behind his words. Anne, long guarded against a cruel world, begins to allow herself to feel vulnerable. Jackson shoots their interactions with soft, intimate lighting, creating a warm emotional sanctuary within the cold steel frame of the ship. This tender human core is essential. It gives the narrative its emotional stakes, establishing what Jack stands to lose once the nightmare begins. Sharply contrasting this blossoming romance is Carl Denham's relentless, predatory campaign to film his picture. Unfazed by the crew's mounting terror or the breakdown of navigation equipment, Denham treats the ship as his private stage. He orchestrates screen tests for her and on the deck, directing her to scream in manufactured fear at an imaginary monster off-camera, an eerie, tragic foreshadowing of the real terror she will soon face. Jack Black plays Denham with a terrifying blend of charisma and callousness. He sees the ship's crew, the actors, and even the looming storm as mere resources to be spent in service of his frame. When Driscoll discovers that Denham's secret map points toward an uncharted island long whispered about in sailors' mythology, Denham doesn't hesitate. He drives the ship straight into the fog, prioritizing a potential box office spectacle over the lives of everyone on board. The transition from suspense to visceral horror occurs with shocking violence as the SS Venture enters the uncharted fog bank surrounding Skull Island. The atmosphere turns thick and suffocating, swallowing the sun whole. Without warning, the ocean beneath them becomes a labyrinth of razor-sharp stone spires and towering, ancient ruins rising out of the foam like jagged skeletal fingers. The ship is violently battered by massive waves, grinding against submerged rocks in a sequence filled with claustrophobic, bone-crunching audio design. The sheer scale of the stone perimeter, carved with giant, terrifying visages of forgotten gods, communicates instantly that this island was built to keep the outside world out, or perhaps to keep something unimaginable locked inside. Once the damaged ship grinds to a halt against the rocks, a small landing party braves the shore, stepping into a nightmare. Jackson directs the first encounter with Skull Island's indigenous inhabitants not as a typical adventure movie discovery, but as a sequence of intense, raw horror. The architecture is brutalist and decaying, a towering, crumbling stone wall separating the human settlement from the primeval jungle beyond. The inhabitants are depicted with harrowing, visceral intensity. They are not mere background extras, but a traumatized civilization living in constant, violent existential dread under the shadow of a tyrant. Without warning, the encounter explodes into chaos. A crew member is brutally executed by a spear, and the party is surrounded in a tense, breathless standoff. Only the sudden intervention of Captain Engelhorn firing warning shots allows the crew to retreat temporarily to the ship. But the island has already chosen its prize. That night, under cover of total darkness, native warriors infiltrate the SS Venture, silently abducting Anne from her cabin. Before Jack or the crew can react, Anne is dragged back across the water, bound to a wooden sacrificial altar suspended over the chasm outside the giant wall. As the village chants in rhythmic, terrifying unison, the massive wooden gates groan open. Out of the pitch-black jungle, the trees shatter, the earth trembles, and a shadow of unbelievable proportions steps into the torchlight, taking its tribute, and drawing Endero into the heart of the wild. The grand reveal of Kong is a masterclass in mythic dread transformed into raw physical presence. Jackson resists the urge to present him as an idealized hero or a cartoonish monster. When the giant ape steps into the torchlight to claim Endero from the sacrificial altar, we see a creature carved by centuries of relentless brutality. His face is a mosaic of jagged scars, his left ear is torn, and his fur is matted with the dirt and dried blood of endless territorial battles. Yet beneath the terrifying physical mass rendered by weighted digital, there is immediate emotional intelligence in his eyes. He doesn't instantly devour Anne. he inspects her with a mixture of possessive curiosity and profound isolation. He grabs her, turns toward the pitch-black canopy, and vanishes into a primeval nightmare, leaving the audience breathless at the sheer scale of his power. Back at the shore, the shock gives way to a desperate, suicidal rescue mission. Led by the weary Jack Driscoll and the stoic, hardened veteran Hayes, a small crew from the SS Venture plunges into the wall of green horror beyond the giant wall. Jackson and the designers at Weta Workshop approached Skull Island not as a mere fantasy backdrop, but as a hyper-evolved, speculative prehistoric ecosystem where time never stopped, only curdled into violence. Every plant possesses thorns, every body of water hides lurkers, and every creature occupies a brutal tier in an unforgiving food chain. The island is an active, living death trap that aggressively rejects human presence, turning the rescue team's trek into a suffocating battle for basic survival. This hostility reaches a chaotic climax in the harrowing Brontosaurus stampede sequence down a narrow, crumbling stone ravine. As venomous Venetosaurus packs flush a herd of massive sauropods into a panic, the sailors find themselves trapped in a terrifying bottleneck of crushing bone and falling rock. Jackson directs this set piece with relentless momentum, weaving handheld camera work with complex digital choreography. The scene builds an escalating sense of spatial claustrophobia. Massive limbs crash around the fleeing crew, men are trampled into the mud, and predators leap across tumbling dinosaur backs. It is a sequence that showcases Jackson's mastery of visual rhythm, balancing sheer physical mass with razor-sharp action beats to emphasize just how hopelessly outclassed human beings are in this ancient realm. Meanwhile, deep within the jungle, the narrative shifts toward its most crucial emotional breakthrough. And, terrified and exhausted, realizes that screaming only invites destruction. In a desperate bid to survive while trapped on a ledge before the towering ape, she reaches back to her roots as a vaudeville entertainer. She begins to perform, juggling rocks, doing slapstick tumbles, and playing the fool. What begins as a survival instinct transforms into a quiet, breathtaking moment of genuine connection. Kong watches, initially puzzled, before releasing a deep, resonant rumble that sounds suspiciously like a chuckle. When he aggressively shoves her over to force a repeat performance, and stands her ground, beating his hand away and sternly shouting, "No!" The giant beast pauses, surprised by this tiny creature's defiance, before slinking back like a scolded child. In this quiet beat, Jackson strips away the monster trope entirely. Kong is revealed not as a mindless force of nature, but as a deeply lonely, emotional being, an isolated king who has finally found someone who does not view him with immediate hatred or sheer terror. The midpoint of Peter Jackson's epic delivers one of the most remarkable back-to-back sequences in modern cinema, shifting seamlessly from breathtaking action choreography to nightmarish body horror. The narrative engine accelerates as Endero escapes into the dense undergrowth, only to be stalked by a trio of Vastidosaurus rexes, hyper-evolved, heavily armored descendants of the Tyrannosaurus. What follows is an unprecedented 3v1 creature brawl that stands as a triumph of visual storytelling. Kong arrives not as a savior driven by sentimentality, but as a territorial titan protecting what is his. Jackson stages the fight across collapsing cliffside vines, tumbling down vertical chasms where gravity itself becomes a character. The brilliance of the Virex battle lies in its continuous narrative progression within the action. Even while suspended upside down in a tangled web of ancient vines, holding and safely in one hand, Kong calculates every blow, using environmental weight and sheer brute force to systematically dismantle his foes. When the duel concludes on the jungle floor with Kong snapping the jaw of the final apex predator, and playfully testing the dead beast's limp jaw with a dry, comedic flick, the scene does far more than deliver adrenaline. It establishes Kong's absolute dominance over this hellish landscape and cements his fierce, unyielding commitment to Anne's safety. Yet, while Kong defends and above, the remaining crew from the SS Venture descends into the literal bowels of the island's cruelty, the infamous bug pit sequence. Having been thrown off a rotting log bridge by Kong into a pitch-black, mud-choked ravine, the survivors find themselves helpless in a moist, silent tomb. Jackson pivots the film's tone entirely into visceral, skin-crawling body horror. Giant, fleshy invertebrates emerge slow and silent from the primordial mud. Carnivorous pitworms consume men whole, while swarming, oversized arachnids trap and overwhelm the helpless crew. There is no heroism here, no grand cinematic score, only the sickening sound of snapping mandibles, squelching mud, and suffocating panic. The death of Hayes and the brutal loss of nearly the entire rescue party underline the utter futility of human intrusion. Denham, watching his crew members get torn apart, protects his film camera above all else, revealing how far his artistic ambition has curdled into sociopathic obsession. The pit sequence strips away any remaining illusion of romantic adventure, leaving only the cold, hard reality of survival. Escaping the horror of the pit, Jack Driscoll pushes onward alone into the high mountain peaks, refusing to abandon Anne. Meanwhile, far above the nightmare of the lower canopy, the emotional core of the film reaches its quietest, most resonant zenith on Kong's high mountain ledge. Away from the constant threat of death, Anne and Kong share a serene moment bathed in the warm light of a golden sunset overlooking the island's ancient vistas. It is here that the boundary between monster and human completely dissolves. Anne beatifically beats her chest and softly whispers the word beautiful, teaching Kong a concept that transcends species. Kong looks at the endless horizon, beats his own scarred chest, and sits in quiet contemplate peace beside her. For the first time in his long, violent life, the lonely king is no longer alone. Jackson shoots this moment with sweeping visual poetry, allowing the silence and subtle digital expressions rendered by Andy Serkis' motion capture performance to convey a profound, unspoken tragic intimacy. This tranquil sanctuary is shattered by Jack Driscoll's perilous infiltration into the lair. Slipping through the shadows while Kong slumbers, Jack finally reaches Anne. But as they attempt to escape down hanging vines, a flock of giant carnivorous bats awakens, inciting a violent confrontation. Kong awakens to find the one creature who brought peace to his tortured existence being stolen away. Driven by frantic heartbreak and raging betrayal, the giant ape roars into the stormy night, setting off a catastrophic chain of events as he furiously pursues them back toward the human wall. The capture of Kong on the stormy shores of Skull Island is a moment of profound moral failure. As the giant ape crashes through the ancient gates in desperate pursuit of Anne, Carl Denham sees not an ancient deity or a tragic, feeling soul, but the ultimate commercial commodity. In a chaotic sequence drenched in sea spray and torchlight, the crew buries the beast under heavy netting and suffocating clouds of chloroform. As Kong slowly collapses onto the sand, his eyes remaining fixed on and until consciousness fades, Denham steps forward to claim his prize. "We're rich, Jack," he boasts into the gale. "I'll give it to the theater. We'll share it with the world." For after all, he's a creature of wonder. Jackson frames this moment with deliberate shame. Human greed has chained a god and dragged him into the cold, transactional machinery of Western entertainment. Months later, the story shifts to the glaring neon lights of Broadway in the winter of 1933. Denham has transformed his tragedy into the ultimate theatrical spectacle, billing Kong as the eighth wonder of the world. The scene inside the packed theater is a masterclass in cultural hubris. High society elites in tuxedos and evening gowns sip champagne while viewing a drugged, chained titan suspended from a steel gallows. To add insult to injury, Denham presents a fake, theatrical reenactment of the sacrifice, complete with a hired actress wearing a blonde wig to play Anne, who refused to participate in the exploitation. When flashbulbs pop and reporters crowd the stage, the sudden blinding flashes panic the confused, degraded creature. Kong snaps his massive steel chains, smashing the proscenium arch and sending the audience screaming into the freezing streets of Manhattan. What follows is not a typical monster rampage, but a frantic, tragic search across a concrete jungle. Kong flips cars and smashes elevated train lines not out of malicious destruction, but out of sheer, overwhelming disorientation. He is looking for the only source of comfort he has ever known in his violent life. The chaos halts in a moment of quiet visual poetry when Anne willingly steps out into the snow-covered street before him. The monster's rage instantly vanishes. In one of the most serene sequences in blockbuster cinema, Kong gently carries Anne to a frozen pond in Central Park. Away from the flashing cameras and screaming crowds, the two share a quiet moment sliding across the ice, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and falling snow. It is a brief, breathtaking echo of their sunset on Skull Island, a fragile sanctuary carved out inside a hostile, artificial world. That sanctuary is brutally shattered by the arrival of military artillery. Forced to flee, Kong climbs the tallest structure in sight, the newly constructed Empire State Building. Jackson treats this iconic vertical climb as an ascent toward a mythic scaffold. As the morning sun rises over Manhattan, bathing the city in a golden haze, Kong reaches the summit, placing Anne safely on the ledge. The aerial attack that follows is staged with agonizing, visceral grandeur. Early 1930s biplanes circle the tower like mechanical insects, their machine guns tearing through the giant ape's flesh. Kong fights back with terrifying physical courage, swatting planes out of the sky to protect Anne, but the outcome is inevitable. The mechanical efficiency of modern warfare slowly overwhelms the ancient force of nature. Bloodied and gasping for breath, Kong beats his chest one last time in defiant majesty. He looks deep into Anne's tear-filled eyes, gently touches her face, and loses his grip on the stone, plummeting thousands of feet to the frozen asphalt below. Down on the crowded street, as police officers push back throngs of onlookers, a reporter remarks that the Army airplanes finally got him. Carl Denham steps through the crowd, looks down at the broken Titan, and delivers the iconic final verdict: it wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed the beast. In Jackson's hands, Denham's line takes on a devastating dual meaning. It is not merely a romantic myth, but a confession of human guilt, a stark acknowledgement that humanity took a rare, untouchable wonder, forced it into a world it did not belong in, and destroyed it the moment it refused to be controlled. At the heart of Peter Jackson's epic lies an unlikely, deeply tragic parallel. Darrow and King Kong are two fundamentally isolated souls who recognize their own pain in one another. Far from being a simple reinterpretation of the damsel in distress and mindless beast archetypes, Jackson and his performers sculpt these characters into complex dual protagonists. Both begin their journeys in environments that treat them as disposable, and in the cold, transactional breadlines of Depression-era Manhattan, and Kong amidst the unforgiving, hyperviolent ecosystem of Skull Island. Their bond works precisely because it is built on mutual respect and shared emotional survival rather than mere visual contrast. And Darrow, portrayed with immense vulnerability and quiet resolve by Naomi Watts, is defined by her fierce refusal to surrender her humanity. When we first meet her in New York, she is starving, yet she retains an internal dignity that sets her apart from those who sell their values for a meal. This emotional resilience becomes her greatest weapon when she is dragged into the nightmare of Skull Island. Unlike traditional monster movie heroines who exist merely to scream and be rescued, and assesses her situation with startling clarity. Faced with a giant, unpredictable predator on a mountain ledge, she doesn't cringe in passive terror. She reaches deep into her vaudeville training, using performance, physical humor, and boundary setting to survive. Watts plays these moments not as high camp, but as high-stakes psychological negotiation. When Kong aggressively shoves her over to force a repeat performance, and stands tall, beats his massive hand away, and barks a sharp, uncompromising no. It is a defining character beat. By refusing to play the victim, she establishes herself as an equal emotional entity. And recognizes that Kong is not a bloodthirsty monster, but a sentient, deeply grieving soul who has never experienced gentle human contact. Her compassion for him does not stem from Stockholm Syndrome, but from an authentic, artistic recognition of his profound solitude. Kong's character design and performance capture work stand as a landmark achievement in visual storytelling. Brought to life by Andy Serkis through pioneering motion capture technology alongside the artists at Weighted Digital, Kong is presented as an aging, battered, and traumatized king. He is explicitly designed as the absolute last surviving member of his species, Megaprimitus Kong. His body is a roadmap of past trauma, covered in jagged, faded scars, missing teeth, a torn ear, and grungy fur caked with dried mud. His posture is slumped under the weight of decades spent fighting off apex predators in an ecosystem that actively seeks to destroy him. Serkis studied gorilla behavioral patterns extensively, bringing an incredible level of nonverbal nuance to the character. Kong's emotional state is conveyed almost entirely through subtle micro-expressions. The slight twitch of a brow, heavy breathing, shifts in gaze, and silent, heavy sighs. Through this painstaking work, Kong's psychological interiority becomes heartbreakingly clear. He is violently territorial because survival demands it, but his territoriality conceals a crushing, unendurable loneliness. When he holds in, he is not keeping a trophy. He is holding the single gentle element in a universe that has known only hostility. This dynamic creates a fascinating thematic counterweight in the character of Jack Driscoll. Played with quiet, intellectual weariness by Adrian Brody, Driscoll represents the traditional Hollywood hero, yet he operates within a narrative structure that continuously subverts his triumph. Jack bravely pursues and across a deadly prehistoric landscape, risking his life down in the bug pit and infiltrating Kong's lair. Yet, as the story unfolds, Jack comes to a haunting realization. While he can rescue Anne's physical body from the island, he can never offer her the pure, unconditional, nonverbal connection she found with Kong. Jack belongs to the civilized world of words, theater, and social expectations, the very world that drives men to chain wonders for financial gain. When Jack watches and looks at Kong on the Empire State Building, he understands that he is a spectator to a tragedy beyond his reach. In this triad of characters, Jackson constructs a heartbreaking meditation on love and loss, a human hero who wins the girl, a monster who dies for her, and a heroine who is forever marked by the magnificent, tragic beast who saw her soul when no one else would. In Peter Jackson's grand reimagining, the ultimate threat to life, art, and nature does not emerge from the dark, prehistoric jungles of Skull Island. It walks through the doors of studio boardrooms wearing a sharp suit and a charming smile. Carl Denham, brought to life with terrifying, manic energy by Jack Black, is the true antagonist of the narrative. Yet Jackson refrains from painting him as a cartoonish, mustache-twirling villain. Instead, Denham is crafted as a chillingly realistic critique of unvetted capitalist ambition, predatory showmanship, and artistic obsession, a mid-century heir to P.T. Barnum who views the entire world, along with the human beings within it, as mere raw material waiting to be processed into profitable entertainment. The casting of Jack Black was a stroke of absolute subversive genius. In 2005, audiences knew Black primarily as an energetic, larger-than-life comedic force. Jackson weaponizes that innate charm, using it as a disguise for a deeply sociopathic core. Denham's magnetism is his most dangerous weapon. He speaks with the rapid-fire cadence of a visionary evangelist, effortlessly convincing desperate people to step into lethal situations under the guise of artistic glory. When he cornered a starving and Darrow in a Depression-era diner, he didn't present himself as an employer, he presented himself as a savior offering her a path to artistic immortality. Black plays these early scenes with genuine warmth and infectious enthusiasm, making it completely believable that Jack Driscoll, and a ship's crew would follow him off the edge of the known map. However, as the voyage slips into uncharted waters, that charismatic facade cracks, exposing a man entirely hollowed out by greed and creative narcissism. Denham is a filmmaker who has conflated the act of recording reality with the right to conquer it. He carries his camera like a weapon of colonization, peering through the lens with an exploitative gaze that commodifies everything in its field of vision. When native spears begin to fly and crew members are brutally slaughtered in the primeval brush, Denham's instinct is never to offer aid or mourn the dead. His instinct is to turn the crank, capture the gore, and preserve the spectacle for paying audiences back home. This moral rot reaches its absolute zenith during the harrowing rescue mission across Skull Island. As his companions are crushed beneath stampeding sauropods or torn apart by giant insects in the suffocating depths of the bug pit, Denham displays a total, sociopathic detachment from human suffering. He does not see the deaths of his crew as human tragedies, but as dramatic production expenses, sacrifices made at the altar of his personal masterpiece. When his precious camera film is finally destroyed during a fall into a ravine, his breakdown is not over the men who lost their lives to protect him, but over the lost footages. He mourns the loss of celluloid while remaining completely blind to the trail of corpses he left across the island. This refusal to accept moral responsibility transforms Denham into a symbol of the dark underbelly of the entertainment industry itself. He represents the sensationalist media machine that feeds off trauma, exoticizing the unknown and stripping wild wonders of their sacred majesty to sell tickets to a bored public. When he realizes he can no longer make a movie on the island, he pivots seamlessly to the next stage of exploitation, capturing the island's living deity, dragging him across the ocean in heavy iron chains, and mounting him on a Broadway stage like a piece of carnival livestock. Denham views himself as a pioneer bringing light to darkness, completely blind to the fact that he is a parasite destroying a fragile ecological and spiritual balance. This leads to the crushing, tragic irony of his final, iconic line atop the Empire State Building. Standing over the broken, bloody corpse of the Titan he brought to New York, surrounded by flashbulbs and weeping onlookers, Denham looks down and declares, "It wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed the beast." In his own mind, Denham is delivering a poetic, highbrow eulogy, framing the monster's death as an inevitable, romantic tragedy of mythic proportions. But Jackson frames the moment to ensure the audience sees through the lie. Denham accepts zero accountability for his actions. He blames an abstract concept, beauty, rather than acknowledging the cold, hard truth. It was his ambition, his greed, and his relentless campaign of artistic exploitation that ripped Kong from his home and drove him to his death. Carl Denham gets the last word, but he remains forever condemned by the trail of destruction he leaves in his wake. What separates Peter Jackson's King Kong from typical creature features is his meticulous refusal to treat human beings as nameless fodder. On Skull Island, death carries physical and emotional weight because every crew member aboard the SS Venture is established as a living, breathing individual with a history, a moral compass, and people who care about them. Rather than populating the ship with disposable archetypes designed merely to pad out a body count, Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens construct a rich, deeply human ensemble. Through quiet, character-driven vignettes during the long voyage across the Pacific, the film builds a fragile web of interpersonal relationships, ensuring that when the island inevitably begins to claim lives, each loss resonates with quiet, heartbreaking power. At the moral center of this supporting cast stands Hayes, portrayed with stoic, worn dignity by Thomas Kretschmann. Hayes is a former soldier and veteran of the First World War, a man who has already witnessed the absolute worst of human capability and the horrors of industrial slaughter. Unlike Denham, who approaches the unknown with arrogant, wide-eyed ambition, Hayes looks at the uncharted ocean with deep, pragmatic caution. He understands that nature is indifferent to human vanity and that the darker impulses of men often bring about their own doom. Hayes functions as the pragmatic conscience of the ship, silently reading Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness in his quarters, a subtle, brilliant literary motif that frames their voyage not as an exciting adventure, but as a dangerous descent into the dark, unmapped corners of the human psyche. This moral groundedness shines brightest in Hayes's tender mentor-protege dynamic with Jimmy, played with raw, restless energy by Evan Park. Jimmy is a young, wild-eyed stowaway whom Hayes pulled off the streets, offering him structure, discipline, and a chance at redemption. Their bond is the emotional anchor of the ship's crew. Hayes doesn't just teach Jimmy how to tie knots or navigate a vessel. He tries to shield the young boy's soul from the cold cynicism of the world, warning him against greed and wild ambitions. The tragic payoff of this dynamic arrives with crushing force on Skull Island. When Hayes is brutally killed by Kong on the cliffside, thrown like a rag doll against a stone face, Jimmy's grief is uncontainable. His transformation from a scared boy into a vengeful, reckless young man firing a Tommy gun into the dark highlights the true human cost of Denham's selfish expedition. Equally vital to the film's thematic architecture is Preston, brought to life with quiet, nervous vulnerability by Colin Hanks. Preston begins the story as Carl Denham's loyal assistant, a timid, well-meaning young man who idolizes his employer and works tirelessly to keep the production from falling apart. Yet, as Denham's ambition shifts from creative passion into sociopathic disregard for human life, Preston becomes the audience's surrogate on screen. He is the quiet observer who sees the moral decay happening in real time, witnessing Denham's step over corpses to protect camera equipment. Hanks plays Preston with a subtle, rising discomfort. His eyes reflect the horror of what they are doing, yet he initially lacks the strength to stand up to Denham's overpowering charisma. Preston represents our own uncomfortable complicity as viewers, the silent witnesses who watch spectacle unfold, aware of the ethical lines being crossed, yet unable to look away. When Preston finally turns his back on Denham's Broadway circus in New York, walking away in quiet disgust, his exit marks a silent moral victory, a realization that some artistic dreams are far too toxic to serve. By taking the time to build these subtle character beats, the shared jokes between sailors, a shared book passed between a veteran and a boy, a quiet glance of regret from an assistant, Jackson elevates the survival narrative into a tragic human drama. When crew members like the ship's cook or the brave first mate Lumpy are consumed in the bug pit or crushed in the jungle, we do not cheer for the monster's power. We weep for the ruined lives, the broken promises, and the families who will never learn how their loved ones vanished into the fog. Through this rich supporting cast, Jackson reminds us that every grand cinematic conquest leaves a trail of quiet human tragedy in its wake. Beneath the thunderous roars, collapsing cliffs, and groundbreaking digital effects of Peter Jackson's King Kong lies a dense, unapologetic critique of modern civilization's foundational vices. Far from being a simple, escapist monster movie, the film operates as a multi-layered thematic treatise on the destructive nature of human greed, the predatory gaze of modern entertainment, and the profound tragedy that occurs when society seeks to conquer, monetize, and display the untamed wild. By grounding a pulp myth in the cold economic realities of the Great Depression, Jackson ensures that every set piece, character choice, and visual motif serves a broader intellectual purpose, interrogating the cost of our insatiable appetite for spectacle. The primary thematic engine driving the narrative is the eternal conflict between man and nature, specifically, the fatal human arrogance that assumes the natural world exists solely to be tamed, mapped, and subjugated. Skull Island is introduced not merely as a dangerous geographical location, but as an ancient, sacred space that actively resists human intrusion. It is an ecosystem that has evolved according to its own brutal laws, completely indifferent to human vanity. Yet, when Carl Denham and the crew of the SS Venture cross the stone wall, they do not arrive with reverent curiosity, they arrive as conquerors and plunderers. Denham views an untouchable deity, a titan that has ruled a prehistoric realm for centuries, as nothing more than a giant novelty act to sell out Broadway theaters. Humanity's inability to respect the sacred autonomy of the wild leads directly to catastrophic bloodshed, demonstrating that our desire to subjugate nature is driven not by strength, but by a fragile, insecure hubris. Equally central to the film's critique is the voyeuristic, predatory nature of the entertainment industry itself. Through the character of Carl Denham, Jackson holds up an uncomfortable mirror to the audience, dissecting the ethics of the camera lens. Denham represents the hypercommodification of art, where human suffering, physical terror, and ecological destruction are reduced to marketable camera content. He does not stop filming when his crew members are being torn apart by prehistoric predators. He turns the crank faster, eager to capture authentic trauma on celluloid. The camera becomes an instrument of violence, a cold, unfeeling tool that strips its subjects of their dignity. When Kong is brought to New York, chained on a Broadway stage before a sea of high society elites snapping flashbulbs, Jackson highlights the dark side of audience consumption. We are forced to ask uncomfortable questions about our own complicity as viewers. At what point does our demand for thrilling entertainment cross the line into the exploitation and destruction of the marvelous? Balancing these dark themes of greed and exploitation is the tender, philosophical exploration of isolation and empathy. In a world defined by transactional relationships and transactional cruelty, Andero and King Kong stand out as two discarded entities who find an improbable sanctuary in one another. And is an impoverished artist discarded by a failing economy, Kong is the last surviving remnant of an extinct species, trapped in endless territorial warfare. Their connection transcends language and species lines because it is built on a shared understanding of solitude. When they sit quietly together on the mountain ledge overlooking Skull Island's sunset, or slide across the frozen pond in Central Park, Jackson strips away all noise and spectacle. In these quiet moments, the film offers its most hopeful thematic argument, that true empathy requires us to look past fear, reject the desire to control, and simply witness the soul of another being. It is this fragile, beautiful connection that ultimately makes Kong's inevitable death not just a victory for civilization, but a heartbreaking loss for the human spirit. Peter Jackson's King Kong speaks through a rich, deliberate visual vocabulary that reinforces its core themes of captivity, majesty, and tragic loss. Far beyond the obvious scale of its digital effects, the film relies on repeating visual motifs, symbolic color palettes, and geometric environmental framing to tell its story. Through the contrast between high-altitude light and deep trench darkness, the physical symmetry of primitive and modern architecture, and the emotional resonance of golden hour light, Jackson embeds deep narrative meaning into the very fabric of every frame. The most prominent visual motif in the film is the juxtaposition of cages, walls, and barriers, which continually redefine the boundary between freedom and imprisonment. This theme finds its dual pillars in the massive Great Wall of Skull Island and the soaring steel skyscrapers of Manhattan. The island's ancient stone wall, crude, decaying, and held together by massive iron chains and wooden beams, was built by a desperate human civilization to keep the wild nightmare of the primeval jungle at bay. Yet, when the action shifts to New York, Jackson visually frames the concrete canyons and Art Deco skyscrapers of Manhattan as an even colder, more unforgiving cage. The steel gallows upon which Kong is chained on Broadway directly mirrors the wooden sacrificial posts on Skull Island. By creating a direct visual rhyme between the primitive stone barrier in the Pacific and the glittering steel grid of New York, Jackson emphasizes that human civilization's urban grandeur is merely a polished, industrialized prison designed to trap and commodify the natural world. This spatial geometry is further developed through the visual contrast between high-altitude light and deep trench darkness. Jackson consistently maps emotional states onto vertical space. The dark, mud-choked ravines of Skull Island, most notably the nightmare landscape of the Bug Pit, are shot with claustrophobic, shadows-heavy compositions that represent moral decay, terror, and raw survival instinct. Down in these trenches, human beings lose their dignity and are consumed by primordial scavengers. Conversely, emotional clarity, connection, and peace are always situated at high elevations bathed in light. It is only when Kong carries and to the highest mountain ledge on the island, far above the blood-soaked canopy, that the chaotic chaos gives way to serene stillness. This high-altitude sanctuary is tied directly to the recurring motif of the setting sun and golden hour lighting. The golden light of dusk serves as a visual bridge between two entirely different worlds. On the mountain cliff overlooking the Pacific, as the sun dips below the horizon, and beats her chest and teaches Kong the sign language gesture for beautiful. The warm, radiant amber light bathes both the giant ape and the tiny woman, dissolving their physical differences in a moment of shared artistic awe. Jackson purposefully replicates this exact golden lighting scheme during the climax atop the Empire State Building. As the sun rises over the Manhattan skyline, casting a golden glow over the cold stone spire, Kong, Anne and share their final, silent look of recognition. The golden light symbolizes a realm beyond human greed, a fleeting, sacred sanctuary where beauty exists uncorrupted by cameras, chains, or commercial exploitation. Finally, Jackson utilizes the visual contrast between organic decay and rigid architectural geometry to highlight the tragic clash between nature and industrialization. Skull Island's environment is defined by curved, gnarled, and rotting textures, ancient stone carved with weeping faces, tangled vines, and overgrown, moss-covered ruins that feel alive yet slowly crumbling. In contrast, Depression-era New York is visually characterized by straight lines, sharp angles, rigid steel grids, and pristine Art Deco symmetry. When Kong steps onto the streets of Manhattan, his organic, scarred, and tactile presence violently collides with the cold, artificial geometry of the modern city. Through this stark visual dissonance, Jackson illustrates that the modern world has eliminated all space for the mythical, leaving no room for a king to exist except as a broken artifact at the foot of a concrete monument. To fully appreciate Peter Jackson's 2005 King Kong, one must look beyond its thrilling surface mechanics and examine the sharp philosophical subtext woven into its architecture. Rather than reproducing the 1933 original's uncritical embrace of 1930s imperialist pulp tropes, Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens turned the narrative into a self-aware meta-commentary on Western colonialism, historical exploitation, and artistic hubris. The film does not merely recount a fantasy adventure. It actively dissects the historical mindset that enabled European and American powers to view uncharted lands and indigenous ecosystems as blank canvases for resource extraction, cultural dominance, and commercial spectacle. By intentionally setting the narrative in 1933, the exact year the original film was released, Jackson creates a critical distance between the modern audience and the Depression-era worldview. The expedition of the SS Venture is framed not as a noble voyage of discovery, but as an act of colonial intrusion. Carl Denham and his crew carry the supreme, unexamined arrogance of Western industrialization into a realm that operates on ancient, sacred principles. When Denham steps onto the shores of Skull Island with his camera, he acts as an agent of cultural conquest. He does not seek to learn, understand, or preserve. His instinct is to record, claim, and commodify. By framing Denham's behavior with such glaring moral bankruptcy, Jackson subverts the classic explorers conquering the untamed wilderness trope, recasting the human invaders as a destructive force that destroys the delicate balance of an ancient world for short-term profit. Crucial to this deeper philosophical structure is the tragic ecological commentary embedded within Kong's character design as the last of his kind. Through the visual evidence scattered across Skull Island, the colossal bones of giant apes lying decaying in the dark caves, Jackson subtly informs the audience that megaprimitus Kong was once part of a thriving, majestic species now reduced to a single, scarred survivor. Kong is a living monument to an extinction event brought on by isolation and an unforgiving, shifting environment. His story serves as a haunting allegory for real-world habitat destruction, poaching, and ecological collapse caused by human expansion. When Denham tranquilizes Kong and drags him across the Pacific, he is not removing a dangerous monster from a jungle. He is accelerating the total annihilation of a unique, irreplaceable evolutionary line, uprooting the sole guardian of an ancient biome to turn him into a neon-lit Broadway sideshow. This ecological tragedy culminates in a profound re-examination of the terms monster and beauty within a capitalist society. Throughout the film, Jackson constantly challenges the audience to define where true monstrosity resides. Is it found in the giant ape who violently defends his territory and fiercely protects the one entity that treats him with gentle respect? Or does it reside in the pristine, tuxedo-clad society of New York that fills a theater to laugh at and mock a chained, traumatized titan? In the cold logic of denim's commercial enterprise, beauty is a commodity to be bought, sold, and manipulated, while anything that resists subjugation is labeled a monster to be broken or destroyed. When Kong falls from the Empire State Building, his death marks the final victory of an artificial, profit-driven world over the untamed marvels of nature. By dismantling the imperialist myths of early 21st century cinema and holding a mirror up to our own historical impulses, Jackson elevates his 3-hour epic into a devastating meditation on human greed. He leaves the audience with a haunting truth, that the true tragedy of the modern world is our relentless habit of destroying the very wonder we claim to admire, only realizing its priceless value after we have turned it into broken debris on the city street. The visual language of modern blockbuster cinema was fundamentally redefined in the digital render farms of Wellington, New Zealand, during the production of King Kong. Coming off the massive achievements of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, Weta Digital was tasked with an undertaking that pushed the boundaries of computer graphics into uncharted territory. They were not merely rendering a secondary digital creature or a background digital double. They were asked to create a 25-foot, 8-ton silverback gorilla who served as the emotional, non-verbal lead of a 3-hour dramatic epic. The technical hurdles were immense, requiring revolutionary innovations in performance capture, digital fur groom generation, environmental rendering, and physical miniature construction that permanently elevated the standard for visual effects across the global film industry. At the epicenter of this technological revolution was Andy Serkis and his dramatic evolution of performance capture. Having previously brought Gollum to life through a combination of physical performance and keyframe animation, Serkis and Jackson aimed for a far higher degree of emotional precision. To prepare for the role, Serkis spent months at the London Zoo studying gorilla behavior and traveled to Rwanda to observe wild mountain gorillas in their natural habitat, mastering their complex vocalizations, physical weight, and subtle social cues. On set, Serkis wore a specially constructed, padded capture suit equipped with weighted limb extenders to mirror the low-slung, quadrupedal gait of a massive silverback ape. More importantly, Weta pioneered advanced facial capture systems, placing dozens of retroreflective markers on Serkis' face to track every subtle twitch of his jaw, brow, and eyes. Rather than translating his performance into a human-like cartoon, Weta's software translated his human facial muscle movements directly onto the complex facial anatomy of a gorilla. Every micro-expression, a flicker of doubt in the eye, the heavy set of a fatigued jaw, or a silent sigh, was captured with breathtaking fidelity, giving Kong a genuine, soul-stirring interiority. Beyond the performance capture pipeline, Weta faced unprecedented challenges in rendering digital fur, water, and dense organic foliage. In 2005, simulating realistic animal fur was considered one of the most notoriously difficult problems in computer graphics. A creature of Kong's immense scale required over 5 million individual strands of digital hair, each needing to react realistically to physical forces such as wind, rain, mud, blood, and physical contact with live-action elements like Endero's hands. To solve this, Weta engineers developed a proprietary fur grooming and simulation software suite named Barbershop. This software allowed digital artists to comb, style, clump, and shade millions of hair strands dynamically. They created layered physical shaders so that mud caked onto Kong's fur would dry, crack, and fall off over time, while water would soak through the outer layer and cause the fur to heavy and matted. When combined with groundbreaking physics solvers for real-time water dynamics, splashing waves, and crumbling digital cliffsides during the Virex battle, Weta achieved a tactile, heavy realism that modern green screen volume shoots rarely match. Yet, despite the groundbreaking digital innovations, Peter Jackson refused to abandon the tactile magic of practical filmmaking. King Kong relied heavily on the extensive use of hyper-detailed physical miniatures, affectionately dubbed bigatures by the production crew. To create the vast, impenetrable landscapes of Skull Island and the bustling streets of 1930s Manhattan, Weta Workshop sculptors built dozens of massive, highly intricate scale models. The Skull Island bigatures included towering cliff faces, crumbling stone ruins, hand-carved ancient walls, and miniature jungle foliage constructed using real preserved moss, sculpted latex, and delicate wirework. For the New York sequences, artists constructed a sprawling, highly detailed scale model of Depression-era Manhattan, complete with hundreds of individual buildings, period-accurate signage, streetlights, and elevated train tracks. These physical models were shot using high-resolution motion control camera rigs and then seamlessly blended with digital matte paintings, volumetric fog, and digital crowds. This hybrid methodology, combining physical miniatures with cutting-edge digital rendering, gave the environments an unmistakable depth, scale, and organic weight that pure computer-generated environments often lack. The technical breakthroughs forged during the production of Jackson's King Kong laid the direct technological blueprint for the next 2 decades of digital filmmaking. The software pipelines, facial performance capture methodologies, and first simulation tools perfected at Weta Digital became the foundational engine for future cinematic milestones. Director James Cameron directly built upon Weta's performance capture technology to create the world of Pandora in Avatar, while Weta later refined Serkis motion capture techniques to produce the critically acclaimed Planet of the Apes reboot trilogy. By treating visual effects not as a cheap cost-cutting shortcut, but as a fine artistic craft, Jackson and Weta Digital created a visual masterpiece that still stands strong 2 decades later, serving as a monument to what is possible when technology is placed entirely in service of storytelling. To understand the extraordinary visual and emotional energy of 2005's King Kong, one must understand the idiosyncratic, uncompromising DNA of its director. Peter Jackson's journey from a low-budget indie filmmaker in New Zealand to the most powerful director in Hollywood is one of the most astonishing arcs in cinema history. By the time he mounted King Kong, Jackson possessed both the absolute creative authority of a global hitmaker and the uninhibited, chaotic passion of an auteur who refused to let his sensibilities be sanitized by studio committees. His directorial signature is visible in every single frame of the film, a distinctive blend of hyperdynamic camera choreography, intimate wide-angle portraiture, visceral action, and unapologetic emotional melodrama that stands as a monumental high-water mark for director-driven blockbusters. Jackson's visual grammar is instantly recognizable, defined by a camera that refuses to remain a passive observer. Throughout King Kong, the camera operates almost as a living, physical entity on set, swirling, plunging, and soaring through space to immerse the audience directly into the chaos. Jackson frequently employs wide-angle lenses held unnaturally close to his actors' faces, a technique honed during his early splatter horror days in films like Bad Taste and Dead Alive. This stylistic choice exaggerates facial expressions, heightening moments of psychological intensity, whether it is Carl Denham's manic, wide-eyed ambition or Endero's breathless terror. During the film's massive action set pieces, Jackson masterfully combines these intimate close-ups with sweeping, panoramic camera movements that track complex physical motion across vast digital and physical spaces. In sequences like the Brontosaurus stampede or the three-way T-Rex brawl, the camera dives underneath crashing dinosaur bellies, swings through tangled cliffside vines, and tumbles down vertical chasms beside the characters. Jackson directs action not through rapid, disorienting cuts that mask poor choreography, but through sustained, fluid tracking shots that maintain total spatial clarity, allowing the audience to feel the agonizing physical weight, mass, and velocity of every impact. What makes Jackson's directorial vision so fascinating is his seamless integration of his raw, B-movie horror roots with sweeping, classical Hollywood emotional grandeur. Long before he was an Oscar-winning director, Jackson was a master of visceral horror, and he brings that unapologetic love for creature feature nightmare fuel directly into this multi-million-dollar studio tentpole. He does not sanitize Skull Island to make it safe for corporate merchandising. He fills the jungle with grotesque, fleshy pit worms, swarming oversized arachnids, snapping mandibles, and brutal gore. Yet, Jackson balances this horrifying, visceral edge with a deep, earnest commitment to classical melodrama. He is entirely unashamed of high-key emotional storytelling, leaning into grand sweeping camera moves, quiet silence, and James Newton Howard's magnificent, romantic orchestral score to elevate the central bond between Anne and Kong. Jackson possesses the rare ability to transition the audience from a horrifying, skin-crawling scene down in the bug pit straight into a quiet, breathtaking moment of emotional transcendence on a golden mountain ledge, without ever causing tonal whiplash. Behind this staggering visual accomplishment was a legendary, almost terrifying level of directorial work ethic and creative obsession. The production of King Kong pushed Jackson and his core team, including producer-writers Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, to the absolute limits of physical and mental human endurance. Jackson operated with a manic, relentless perfectionism, routinely working 20-hour days during principal photography and post-production. During the edit, as the release date rapidly approached and weighed a digital race to complete over 2,000 complex visual effects shots, Jackson literally lived in the editing suite at Stone Street Studios, taking micronaps on a cot in his office. His physical transformation during the shoot became a famous point of industry conversation. The director shed dozens of pounds under the crushing stress and sheer physical labor of mounting the film. He personally supervised every single department, hand-approving every digital fur groom, every sound design effect, every miniature model detail, and every edit. This was not a film manufactured by a studio assembly line or shaped by corporate test screenings. It was a film dragged out of thin air through the absolute, unyielding willpower of one man obsessed with fulfilling a childhood dream.